Good afternoon and welcome to Project-Based Learning and Web 2.0 Technology Integration. My name is Dayna Laur and I'm a National Faculty member with the Buck Institute for Education. I am also a classroom teacher of social studies, and I've been teaching for the last 14 years. I am located in South Central Pennsylvania, and as a teacher in Pennsylvania, about 5 years ago, I was afforded a wonderful opportunity by the Commonwealth. A grant was started called Classrooms for the Future, in which all core content area teachers were eligible to participate. My school is a very tech-heavy school to begin with, and so we very quickly jumped on the bandwagon for Classrooms for the Future and applied for the grant, and I was able to receive a classroom set of laptop computers that were designated solely for my students. I also received an interactive whiteboard, and as a district we were given web conferencing equipment so that we could do video conferencing with other schools in the state as well as schools from around the world and around the country. So Classrooms for the Future is really what propelled me into the technology integration piece within my classroom. Prior to Classrooms for the Future, I was, like many teachers around the country, struggling with 140 of my other colleagues to share carts and to vie for signing up in the computer lab. So as we move through this afternoon, we are going to focus on a couple of different things. We're going to take a look at the design, the assessment, and the management of project-based learning units and how they are supported by Web 2.0 tools. We are also going to take a look at how we can choose the appropriate technology for integration into our project-based learning units. And finally, we are going to be able to provide you with a few resources that BIE has available to help you in your quest for integrating Web 2.0 tools into your project-based learning units. So let's get started with the design and how that is supported by Web 2.0 tools. Please keep in mind that just because you are using technology in your classroom, it does not necessarily mean that you're doing so in a 21st century manner. We want to be sure that we are not using technology simply for the sake of using technology. So as you are designing your project-based learning units, you of course want to keep in mind the 8 elements of PBL, of which if you need a refresher on those, you can refer to our archived webinar on the essential elements of project-based learning. But you also want to work on how those tools, the Web 2.0 technology, can specifically support those 8 elements, not simply replace what you were doing prior to project-based learning. Just like project-based learning is very different from an add-on project at the end of the unit, we want to ensure that our technology is not that add-on piece. We want the technology to become our main course and not simply the dessert. Now, it is certainly understandable if you do not have unlimited technology resources available at your disposal. However, whenever you do have the opportunity to use the technology, you want to make sure that you are choosing to use it in a way that, again, is not an add-on piece, but is done to support your project-based learning experience for your students. Perhaps this graphic will help to visualize what I'm talking about. We want to make sure that content really is at the foundation of our classes. That significant content is the most important piece. Project-based learning really then becomes the heart of creating an engaged classroom in which the content is delivered authentically. And finally, the Web 2.0 technology is the support for enhancing our 21st century skills, our collaboration, our critical thinking, and the creativity and communication piece that our students have. Now, you may or may not know where you fall currently in terms of your integration of technology. And perhaps you would want a more analytical look at this. And if you would, you can take this survey that has been designed by Lodi, in which it helps you to turn up the heat in your classroom. So H stands for higher order thinking, E for engagement, A for authenticity, and the T is the technology integration. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on the technology integration. I would encourage you to take the Lodi survey at some point and to reflect on your own results, because what we want to do is to move in the direction of level 5 and level 6. Hopefully none of you are in level 1, but many of you might be in level 2, and that's certainly a place to start because we as teachers need to feel comfortable with the technology. However, as you start to put the technology into the hands of your students, we want to make sure that it is not simply an add-on and it's not needed just for task completion. If you have unlimited resources available, such as myself, you would be in level 6. If you don't have the unlimited resources yet, you certainly want to be in level 5, where there's a direct connection to the task completion with the resources that you do have in terms of the technology use. We also want to think about our ISTE standards that have been created. Now, the standards look a little bit different for students, teachers, administrators, and any technology coaches that are out there. But in any case, we need to support what ISTE calls an increasingly connected global and digital society. Therefore, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and creativity are all very highly stressed and are done so in a platform that is supported through the use of technology. So just like level 5 and level 6 in turning up the heat, calls for that integration, so do these ISTE standards. And these 21st century skills really are that hallmark of project-based learning. You also need to think about the design of your projects and what tools you're using and choose those tools very carefully. This visual is one that I really like. You can see there it's attributed to the visualblooms.wikispaces.com. And I really like this because you can see that many of the tools are repeated on this visual representation of Bloom's taxonomy. You can use the tools at a very low level of Bloom's. However, you can also use those same tools at a much higher level of Bloom's. So we want to move into the analyzing, the evaluating, and absolutely into the creating piece as we are having our students complete these project-based learning units. And I also wanted to ensure that everyone participating and or watching this archived version of the webinar understand that the technology that you use in your classroom can be very basic and still be effective. You can also use very extensive technology in your classroom as you are creating these units. So as you think about that Lodi survey, as you think about the ISTE nets, think about where you might fall in the design of your project-based learning unit with the technology. And oftentimes, truly, the technology piece can help to facilitate your project so that the duration in terms of contact hours changes. You may need fewer contact hours to complete your project because of the technology and the collaboration that students can do outside of the classroom. We're not going to have the opportunity during this webinar to go through all of the 8 elements of project-based learning. We've certainly touched on 2 of the main core elements, the significant content and the 21st century skills. But as I move forward in the webinar, I want you to think about the other 6 elements and how some of these tools that I discuss can support these other 6 elements. How can these tools give students a voice and choice? How can they promote revision and reflection? How can they provide for students a way in which they have a public audience? So again, if you are unfamiliar with these elements or if you need a little bit of a refresher on them, please refer to the archived webinar on our 8 essential elements of project-based learning. Quite frequently, we find critics of project-based learning saying that PBL is content light. However, we find here at the Buck Institute for Education, if projects are designed well, they are creating these parallel tracks or paths for students in which the significant content and the 21st century skills are equally important. And it is focused on the content. And the Web 2.0 technology really can help you to ensure that the students are focused on the significant content. I'm going to go ahead and start to get into some of the specific Web 2.0 tools. Some of these tools may be ones with which you are familiar. And if you are familiar with those, feel free to share with us ways in which you use those tools. Some of these tools may be brand new to you because we were all certainly at different levels in our technology integration, and perhaps some of these tools are ones that you use, but maybe you've never thought of using it in the particular manner that I'm going to mention. So the first 5 tools that I'm going to focus on look at how the content can be propelled in the projects that your students are completing. The first tool that we're going to take a look at is Wikispaces. Now, you may use a different type of wiki. PB Wiki would be one of those. I prefer to use Wikispaces in my own classroom because that's what I'm most comfortable with. You can see this is an actual example of something that I've used within my own classroom. Some of the other screenshots that we may take a look at will not have actual classroom examples because of the use of student names and or because I no longer had access to the project because students left with their passwords and their usernames. But this is one that I have because I do own the wiki. In fact, I have many wikis for my students because I like to use the wiki as a warehouse, if you would, for the content. Think about using Wikipedia in your own lives and the content that is included in Wikipedia. And so I really use it for the same type of thing. So my students are housing their information and the content on their wiki that I have created for them. And this allows me to make sure that students have included all of the content that they need. They can share the content with other members of the class and with members of whatever outside audience that we might be using for our end products. Now, unfortunately, with Wikispaces, one of the drawbacks is only one person may edit one page at a time. So I might have multiple people editing different pages, but only one person can edit one page. So it doesn't really help me in terms of the collaboration factor. So if any of you out there are tech junkies, you can probably guess what my next slide is. Frequently, I have my students use Google Docs for the collaborative writing that they will do to include their content and then copy and paste it into their wiki. This is a great piece for the students to be able to share the information, to write collaboratively, and to really do some editing and peer editing before it goes into their final product of the wiki for the content piece. So Google Docs can be used in many, many different ways within your own classroom. This just happens to be one of the ways in which I utilize Google Docs. You could also use it for things like a silent debate in which you can monitor the content information that students are using, and quite frankly, that could move into the assessment piece that we'll talk about a little bit later. Sometimes with a final product, as I allow students to choose what a final product might look like, they may decide that they want to create a website. And there are many different free Web 2.0 tools that they can use to do that. There are also some tools that are uploaded or applications that are on their own computers that they can use. But I have found, and my students have found, Wix to be one of the best choices for creating, as you can see here from the screenshot, a free and stunning website. It's a great way to make a very professional presentation for your students if they want to do it in front of a panel. It's also a great way to share your content with a community or a target audience, or to share your content with someone that is halfway across the world. The other great thing that I really like about Wix is that there's no programming involved. Anyone can use it. I very quickly picked up on how to use Wix, so you don't have to be a tech savvy person in order to create a great website. Prezi is something that you might want to choose, though, for voice and choice. If your students don't want to create a website, perhaps they want to create a Prezi instead. I personally am not a Prezi user. It is, quite frankly, something that's slightly confusing for me because I am a very linear thinker. However, we know many of our students aren't. And Prezi is simply an awesome way for them to be able to embed not only content, but video, pictures, to think critically about the content that they're using, and then to share it with others. And they can do so collaboratively. You can see that this particular one was done in 2010, so that is a little while ago, but I have not taught this particular class since 2010. It was an American Studies class, and it was a war and conflict unit, just as some brief background to show you the power of Prezi. In this particular project, my students had looked at all of the 20th century wars, and they were taking lessons learned from those 20th century wars in order to create a proposal to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. And during this particular time period, my brother-in-law, who is in the Special Forces, was stationed in Afghanistan. And so my students had Skyped with him at the beginning of the project, and then ultimately sent these Prezis to him halfway across the globe and to his platoon of men to review their proposals on how they wanted to create a withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. And you'll actually see a few slides a little bit later on for other portions of this very large project that we did that took us about 8 weeks. The final tool that I want to talk about in terms of the content management piece would be Museum Box. Oftentimes you see students that create dioramas or models of a particular event that has occurred in history, but Museum Box doesn't just have to be for history. It could be for science pieces. It could reflect something that has been studied in literature. Certainly art would be a great piece or a great course to use Museum Box for. The wonderful thing about Museum Box is that you are able to view so that you can have a public audience, what you've created in Museum Box, and comments can be made on the museum boxes that have been submitted by various students. It's wonderful because you can determine the size of your box, how many cubes you want in it, and on each side of the cube you can include not only text, but you can also embed video and images, and you can record things that would be included within your cubes to then create your own museum box. So a wonderful way for the students to exhibit their knowledge of the content, as well as whether or not they've thought critically about the content. Let's go ahead and move into the assessment of project-based learning units and how Web 2.0 tools are supported by them. Again, I will show you a variety of tools, some of which you may or may not be familiar with. Oftentimes in project-based learning, as mentioned before, the fear is that teachers can't cover enough of content and material. But I want you to remember that covering really isn't teaching. So project-based learning allows students to really learn something well. They are able to dig deep into a topic and they are able to reach a deep understanding of the concepts, but we still have to assess that. Sometimes we assess it individually, sometimes we do peer assessments, but the Web 2.0 tools really can facilitate the assessment piece of it. I think you'll also see in some of these tools that I talk about that they really can overlap into the design process as well. The first tool that I'm going to talk about is Wordle. And my second grader loves Wordle, and she always wants to make Wordles on my computer, and they make Wordles in her class. I'm not exactly sure how she's being assessed, however, using Wordles in her classroom. I think it's more for the fun factor. So using Wordle for assessment can come in a variety of ways. As you can see, I made a sample Wordle, and this reflected what participants in a workshop that I had conducted earlier this year talked about in terms of what we wanted our 21st century students to be. So we can see critical thinkers, problem solvers, having ability and skills to work together as a team. So I was able to assess my workshop participants and do so very quickly and formatively in terms of their thinking about 21st century learners. In my own classroom, as I assess my students, it might be taking something that they have written, because I like to include strong written components in all of my project-based learning units, and then putting it into a Wordle to see what ideas come to the forefront that they focus on the most. It's also a great way to have students perhaps assess each other, as well as assessing other speakers or writers. So you could have students copy and paste text into a Wordle from a primary source document, and then they can do their own assessment of it and analyze and evaluate what has been written or said, and then you can assess those critical thinking skills that your students are using. As a social studies teacher, I find timelines to be very important in my own classroom, especially when I teach a history course. And timelines are great to assess whether or not students can think in a chronological manner and understand chronology. Time, continuity, and change happen to be one of the National Council for Social Studies' main themes or strands that students should be able to understand. In this particular timeline, it went back to my project on the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, but in learning about the 20th century wars to help support their proposed plans, we did it as a thematic study. And as a thematic study, they still needed to understand the chronology of events. And so I was able to assess as they created these online timelines, and for this particular one, we happened to use X timeline. There are many others that I've used, Time Toast and Dippity, but the students had to include the chronology of major events in the war, and then they had to evaluate those events and their impact on the war. So in this particular screenshot, you're only seeing the chronology of the events, but in other portions of this X timeline, I was able to click on and see the evaluation of those events and how they evaluated them, which is very, very important. I mentioned earlier that I have a second grader, and her last project was a timeline project, and it certainly wasn't project-based learning because she simply had to come home and paste pictures of her life on a poster board and write a one-sentence description of what happened. Her teacher assessed her on how neat her handwriting was and whether or not she included all of the 8 elements that she had to include that were important in her life. Not much in the way of assessing critical thinking. So this X timeline allows me to assess the critical thinking that my students are doing. Our next tool is Wallwisher, and Wallwisher can be used for a variety of things, including brainstorming. This particular screenshot that I have shows Wallwisher as an assessment where my students had to post examples of war and conflict that exhibited imperialism, again, using that same particular war and conflict project that I've already referred to. This is a quick way for me to formatively assess whether or not my students understood the topic of imperialism. And they have to do so in limited characters, which is also a great way for them to learn how to be very concise in what they write. Edmodo is a tool that I use as a learning management system in my classroom, and it has many, many different features. And if you're interested in learning more about Edmodo and how I used it in project-based learning, there is an archived webinar that I did back in December on the use of Edmodo in project-based learning, and I take you through an entire project in my classroom and how Edmodo supports it. But in this particular instance, I just very briefly want to touch on the quiz feature in Edmodo. So you can give a multiple choice quiz, a true-false quiz, a short answer quiz. It's really up to you. The beauty of it is Edmodo will automatically grade it from your key, and if you are using the gradebook feature of Edmodo, it will automatically upload the grade into the gradebook. It's also nice that once you create a quiz once, all you have to do is upload that quiz and share it to another class. You do not have to recreate the quiz. I included this feature, however, because it shows that you can still use traditional assessments in your project-based learning units. You do not have to throw out all tests and quizzes just because it is project-based learning, and this is just one way in which you can use that much more traditional assessment. Diigo is my final tool for assessment, and Diigo is something that I use almost on a daily basis within my own classroom. It is wonderful for talking to the text and doing so in an online collaborative environment. So my students have to do current events each week in all of my classes, and they have to bookmark an article, they have to highlight important features of the article, and they have to comment and think critically on the highlighted portions of that article. Those articles are then shared to our class as a group, and students then have to pick a shared article and respond to the comments that have been made by their classmates. So it is a wonderful way for me to assess both their reading, their writing, their comprehension, and their critical thinking skills that occur. And let's move on to the management of project-based learning and the use of Web 2.0 tools. Frequently we find Teachers shy away from project-based learning because it is loud and it is messy. And yes, it is going to look very different in a project-based learning classroom than it does in a traditional classroom where the students are in rows and the teacher is at the front of the room instructing. However, the use of Web 2.0 tools can make your life much more organized in a project-based learning environment, and I think you can probably already refer to many of the tools that I've talked about for organizational purposes. Often, project-based learning is also criticized for having no individual accountability. I can assure you that there is plenty of individual accountability in my own classroom. We do try to balance out individual and group effort and accountability, but the web really ensures a way in which I can make sure that every individual is participating, collaborating, and thinking critically and learning the content. So the first tool I want to talk about is called Scrumy. The wonderful part about Scrumy for me is I don't have to do anything. My students do it all. They simply go to Scrumy and they start a new Scrumy feature in which they are given a URL that is unique to them, and then they share the URL with me. This particular one, this Polecats 90 cache, is a sample one that I created. And basically the way it works is that students create stories in that far left-hand column. You can see for this particular one, they had to do research, a video documentary, a survey. That's just a portion of it. And then they create notes. So under research, we had weapons of war, we had war on the home front, major battles, and women in war as an example. And these notes can be moved from column to column. And you can see that each note is assigned to a particular student. So the students are creating all of this, not me, but I can very quickly visualize at what point in the project each of my groups are, and at what point each individual in each group where they are in the project as well. So if I have a particular group that has more in the to-do column than other groups, I know that something's going on and I need to intervene. Or if one student has more of his post-it notes or her post-it notes in the to-do column than the other students in the group, then I need to check up and see what's going on. Because as you can see, the notes are color-coded, so all of the yellow post-it notes belong to Sally. All of the green belong to Pete. Now the students simply move them from column to column, so as they are working on them, they're in progress. Once the student has finished it, they move it into the verify column, and the note should not be moved out of verify into done until all students have in fact verified that that particular portion of the project has been done, and done so to meet the standards of all members of the group. Now certainly you can have group members that would move other people's post-it notes, but then that's for you, the teacher, to be able to come back at the very end. If Sally says that Pete didn't do his work, well, Sally, it was at some point in the verify column, and it was your responsibility to ensure that Pete also did the work that you felt he needed to do to the level that he needed to do it. So it's just a nice management tool for me, and again, it's a visual tool for me, it's an easy tool for me, and it's a tool that I don't have to do anything. The students set the entire thing up. Primary Pad is our next tool, and I really like Primary Pad, first of all, because it is designed for schools. There are several other versions that are out there that are not specifically designed for schools, but with Primary Pad, students can not only brainstorm or include content, and you can do assessment, but I can manage simply by looking at, again, color-coded information as to who is contributing, and I can, just like in Scrumy, see perhaps which student has fallen behind and what I can do to ensure that they in fact are contributing to the group and what they need to do to improve their performance insofar as their collaborative efforts. So primary pad can be used for a variety of things. Management is one of my pieces. Oftentimes I can use it for a combination of management and assessment, as I have my students responding to particular prompts that I give them in the middle of a project to formatively assess them, but again, managing in terms of who is contributing what. Lino It is very similar to Wallwisher in terms of having stickies. However, Lino It really helps students to organize what they need to accomplish and when they need to have it done. You can see here you can add tags and dates. It's great for those students who are visual learners who aren't good with seeing things as a list, but if you look at the left-hand version versus the right-hand version and organizing ideas, you can color code your post-it notes, which is a little bit different from Wallwisher, and that color coding piece is very nice for those students who need that organizational feature. I do teach a course that is co-taught, and I have some extremely low-level IEP students in that course, and so the more that I can provide them with visualizations, the better off those students are. And so this just happens to be one of those tools that is highly visual and highly effective for those students. Glogster is another piece that can be used in terms of voice and choice and content information, but Glogster can also be used for your own management purposes of project-based learning. You can see this is a sample that was taken from one of our teachers in one of our PBL 101 workshops that created everything about her project on her Glogster. So you can see the students could click on the checkpoints in project, they can see the calendar, they can see what the team rules are, they can see all of the due dates, and they can click on project in a nutshell and they can get an overview of the project. All the documents are embedded in here. So it's a very nice one-stop shop for you to have your students be able to have access to all of the project materials and due dates, as well as parents. If you don't want to use Glogster to set up the entire thing, I am actually going to go very quickly back to Edmodo because Edmodo does have a calendar feature. I mentioned before that I use it as a learning management system, and that calendar feature really helps me and my students to stay on track with a particular project that we are doing in class. Now let's move on to choosing the appropriate technology for integration into project-based learning. And again, we really need to focus on the fact that this is for our students and not for us, the teacher. Certainly technology can make our lives easier. I no longer have to drag home stacks of journals because I can grade online blogs that my students are doing from home. So it is quite different for me as a teacher, but ultimately I want to choose tools that are appropriate for my students. So as you are choosing your tools, whether they be some of the tools that I discussed in today's webinar or other tools that you have, please keep this particular phrase in mind. You also want to think about what is perhaps blocked at your school. Fortunately, I work in a district that is very open to almost anything and everything in terms of Web 2.0 tools. And if it happens to be blocked, I can request that it be unblocked. Pretty much the only thing that is blocked is Facebook at my school and YouTube for students. However, teachers can get to that. Some districts I know are much more tight in terms of what they block, so this is something that you want to check out before you actually use the tools. And you also, if you want to use the tools, be able to prepare a really convincing argument as to why you should be able to use their tools and their educational values. You also want to think about a tool and whether or not it's going to be around for a long time. We can look at GeoCities and how that was shut down. And you can also have sites that have been around for a really long time, but that can still be eliminated. I know I went into a panic several months ago when Delicious was perhaps going to be shut down by Yahoo, and I have hundreds and hundreds of tags on my Delicious site, and I didn't know what I was going to do without it. So you have to have a backup plan. It's okay if things are shut down because there are always sites that replace them. When Etherpad decided to shut down because the folks at AppJet were bought out by Google, basically there was such an outcry from educators that they decided to open source the code. So now we have things like PiratePad and PrimaryPad and TitanPad that are out there. So there are others around, but think about your tools and what might happen if that particular site is shut down or no longer exists. What is your backup plan? Or something like Ning that originally was free, and then when they decided to start charging for it, I had to look for alternative sites for my students to use in the classroom because I didn't want to have to pay for Ning. You also want to think about your sites that you're using and your tools that you're using and how intuitive they are. Think about online banking. I'm sure many of you do online banking and how intuitive online banking is. So for the most part, students are very tech savvy and within a matter of minutes can quickly pick up the tools. In fact, much quicker than many of us as teachers do. But think about those sites and those tools and how intuitive they are. You don't want your class to turn into a technology class, because you are using tech to enhance your class and projects and not merely teaching the technology. So we don't want the technology to override what it is and your significant content that needs to come forth in that particular project. The free piece of this is also very important. I had mentioned Ning and how I quit using Ning when they decided to start charging for it. Things like Wikispaces, they do have free educator accounts. Many of these tools out there have free educator accounts, many tools of which I didn't even discuss. Often the paid version does have a similar piece for free, or they might have a free trial. So do you like it and want to purchase it, or do you only need it for one project and won't have to go beyond the free trial? So those are just a few things that you might want to keep in mind. This particular site is one that I love in terms for voice and choice for my students, and just in terms of having a warehouse of a variety of Web 2.0 tools. I know I didn't talk about any of the ones that are even shown on this particular screenshot, but many of these I have used in my own classroom. I don't have to know how to use all of these tools. My students, again, figure it out very, very quickly. And if I want to give them options, that voice and choice element of project-based learning, this is a great place to point my students. So if they need a presentation tool, they can find from this list of presentation tools what they want to use. If they are looking to do some sort of graph, they can click on graphing tools and it comes up with a very long list of graphing tools that they may use. So this Cool Tools for Schools has really been one of those go-to sites for both myself and my students. This particular site is one of those sites that you can just very easily get sucked into and spend many hours just checking out the variety of tools that are out there. This go-to Web 2.0 is amazing in the different tools that are out there. Not all of these tools are educational. Not all of these tools are things that you would want to use in your classroom. Some of them you might want to use personally, but many of them were not even started for education, but can be used for education. I think you can see Pinterest is up there, and I know many educators are right now using Pinterest for a variety of educational purposes, and that wasn't even necessarily the intent of Pinterest when that particular tool was conceived. Hopefully, after a good 45 minutes of this webinar, you don't feel like this, because we want you to have some support from BIE in terms of what we will provide you with and services that we can help to make your life a little bit easier in terms of how you are going to integrate Web 2.0 technology into your project-based learning. So you do have support and time to do this because we've tried to make it very easy for you. So what can we do for you and what can BIE help you out with? The first of these tools is a free tool that we have. We have a site community with Edmodo, and you can see here we have well over 3,600 members, and this number increases daily. We've only had the site for a couple of months, and the membership has just grown like you wouldn't believe, and it is free for all educators. You can join, and we post a variety of resources on our Edmodo site. We do have a collection, you can see there up at the top, in which we have archived all of our webinars. We have downloadable resources that you have access to. But the great thing is this is a community, and these 3,600 members are interacting with one another, providing and sharing resources. If you have a question, you can post it in the community, and one of our national faculty members can reply to you, as well as the 3,600 other experts from around the globe that are involved can provide you with information as well. So our Edmodo community is a fabulous resource to utilize. You may be interested in also joining us at PBL World in June in Napa, California. So if you are a wine lover, it's a great place to visit. If you just love the beauty of the countryside, Napa is gorgeous, and there will be educators from around the world that are coming in for this event. It is 1 week before ISTE, and we will have a specific project-based learning and Web 2.0 tool session that will be offered on Thursday and Friday of that week. And we will also be offering our project-based learning 101 workshops if you need more help with the 8 elements of project-based learning and how to design your PBL units. So feel free to join us at PBL World. You can register and come hang out in Napa and then head down to San Diego for ISTE and get more of your technology fix the week following. So this time, if you have any questions, I would take any of those questions that you might have. All right, so I see we have a couple of questions coming in here. The first one is, how can I convince my network administrator that technology I want to use is safe for my students? Again, that goes back to the fact that you really need to be aware of any of the pitfalls of a particular technology tool. If you are not using Primary Pad and you're using something like Titan Pad or Pirate Pad, there is the possibility that an outside person could get into the pad and post things in the pad that you don't want. But there are certainly ways around that. Having a URL that is not common, one of the URLs that is created, auto-created by Titan Pad, is a great way to fix that potential problem. So you having the background information and playing around with a tool that may previously be blocked would be a way to convince your network administrator. And also using tools that are designed specifically for educational purposes. things like Edmodo that are specifically for education, or creating a Wikispace and creating an educational Wikispace account and making it a private account that cannot be accessed by anyone else, having members only, and you have to approve those members. So just having that very direct conversation with network administrators and or principals is a very positive thing to do. All right, I see we have another question. Does every scaffolded activity that supports your project have to be connected to technology? Absolutely not. Prior to my Classrooms for the Future funded grant, I didn't have technology in my classroom every day, and I was able to do project-based learning without it. And the portions of the project that I felt needed to be supported by technology, I was able to schedule and check out computer carts and or schedule the computer lab. So it does not have to be connected to technology at all times. All right, so the question is, do you have any suggestions for teachers new to technology integration on how to build their comfort level with the technology? Quite frankly, as I mentioned before, oftentimes you don't have to know how to use the technology specifically. Your students very quickly figure that out. So having your students teach you the technology is something that empowers them and helps you to understand that you don't have to understand all of the technology. Remember, it's not a technology class. Your core content is what is the most important piece. And just playing around with the technology yourself helps you to gain a certain level of comfort with that. All right, it looks like we are finished at this point with the webinar. And before we go, I do invite you to come visit us at BIE.org and check out a lot of the resources that we have available there, many of which are also on our BIE community. And if you have any specific questions for me, you can find me on Twitter at Daylin, or you can feel free to email me at dana@bie.org. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us, and we hope to see you in future webinars.